Hello everyone and welcome back to Trail of Secret. I know many of you use these videos to unwind or even fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story number 1, it was a quiet evening when I stopped by the convenience store near my apartment. I had just finished a long day at work and only needed a few essentials. Milk, bread, maybe a snack for later. The store was nearly empty, the kind of stillness that made every small noise seem amplified. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and the cool air carried a faint scent of cleaning supplies and old receipts. I wandered through the aisles, grabbing what I needed, enjoying the solitude. By the time I reached the checkout counter, I was the only customer there. The cashier, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a blank expression, gave me a small nod as he began scanning my items. The rhythmic beeping of the scanner filled the silence. I watched absent-mindedly as he bagged my groceries, his movements mechanical, almost robotic. But then something changed. He paused mid-scan, his hand hovering over an item, his gaze lifting to meet mine. His eyes held something strange, an emotion I couldn't quite place. "You should be careful," he said in a low, almost urgent whisper. I blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" His eyes flickered toward the entrance for the briefest moment, before he shook his head. "Just be careful," he repeated, his voice barely above a murmur. Then, as if realizing he had spoken out of turn, he quickly resumed scanning my items, his expression returning to neutral. I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. "Careful of what?" I asked, but he didn't answer. His focus was now on the screen in front of him, as if I had imagined the whole thing. I hesitated, debating whether to press him further, but something in his demeanor told me he wouldn't say more. Instead, I handed him my card, paid for my groceries, and took the receipt. He slid across the counter toward me. His hand lingered for a fraction of a second before pulling away. The moment I stepped outside, a gust of cold air hit me, sending a shiver down my spine. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few scattered cars under the dim glow of the streetlights. I walked quickly to my car, my footsteps echoing against the pavement. Sliding into the driver's seat, I locked the doors instinctively. I glanced down at the receipt in my hand, half expecting to see some cryptic message scrawled across it. But it was just a normal receipt, listing the items I had purchased. Shaking my head at my own paranoia, I started the car and pulled out of the lot. But as I drove, the cashier's words echoed in my mind. "Be careful." Of what? Halfway home, I noticed something unsettling. A car in my rearview mirror. It wasn't tailgating or driving erratically, but it had been behind me since I left the store. I tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but when I made an unnecessary left turn onto a side street, the car did the same. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just another driver heading in the same direction. But as I made another turn, then another, and the car followed each time, my pulse quickened. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. My apartment complex was just a few minutes away. If the car was still behind me when I got there, I would keep driving, maybe circle the block instead of going straight home. But just before I reached my street, the car abruptly turned off onto another road. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Something still felt wrong. I pulled into my parking space and sat for a moment, scanning my surroundings. The lot was empty, the only sound the faint hum of distant traffic. I grabbed my groceries and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. As I unpacked my items, my mind kept replaying the events of the evening. The cashier's warning, the lingering stare, the car that had followed me. Maybe it was all a coincidence. Maybe I was just tired and overthinking things. But later that night, as I lay in bed, something woke me. A sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. They weren't coming from inside my apartment, but from outside my window. My bedroom was on the second floor, and below it was the narrow alleyway that separated my building from the next. Slowly, I sat up and reached for my phone. my fingers hovering over the screen. Should I call someone? The police? A friend? I crept toward the window, heart pounding. Carefully, I peeked out. At first, I saw nothing. Just the usual dimly lit alley, trash bins lined up against the wall. But then, a shadow moved. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of the streetlights. Watching, stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced. Had they followed me from the store? Was this what the cashier had been warning me about? I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed a number. But before I could press call, the figure moved again. This time, away from my building, disappearing into the darkness. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity before finally forcing myself to breathe. The alley was empty again, but the feeling of unease didn't fade. The next morning, I returned to the store hoping to find the cashier. I needed answers, but when I asked about him, the other employees looked confused. "There's no one here by that name," one of them said, frowning. "Are you sure you got the right store?" I felt my stomach drop. "He was here last night, middle-aged guy, short hair, tired eyes." The employees shook their head. "We close at 10. The last shift is always covered by the same 3 people. None of them fit that description." A cold chill ran through me. I knew what I had seen, I knew what I had heard, but the cashier, the man who had warned me, was never there to begin with. Story number 2. It was a quiet Thursday night, and I was walking home from work. The streets were nearly empty, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. I was lost in thought, replaying the events of the day, when I noticed something unusual. A man was standing under a lamppost about 50 feet ahead of me. He wasn't moving, just staring straight ahead, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. Something about him made me uneasy, but I told myself I was overreacting. As I got closer, I could see his hands fidgeting nervously, and I instinctively crossed the street to avoid him. But just as I passed by, he turned his head slightly, and I heard him whisper something. "Don't go home." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to look at him, but he was already walking away, his figure disappearing into the darkness. My mind raced. Was he talking to me? Or was it just a coincidence? I shook it off and continued walking, but the words lingered in my mind. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was on edge. I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The lobby was empty, and the elevator ride felt longer than usual. When I finally stepped inside my apartment, I locked the door behind me and let out a sigh of relief. But as I turned on the lights, I noticed something strange. The air felt different, heavier somehow. And then I saw it, a single muddy footprint on the floor near the window. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I hadn't left the window open. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached it, peering outside. The street below was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the building made me jump, and I kept replaying the man's words in my head. "Don't go home." The next morning, I called the building manager to check the security cameras. He told me there was no sign of anyone entering my apartment, but he did mention something odd. A man had been seen loitering near the building earlier that evening, wearing a hood and acting suspiciously. I tried to put it out of my mind, but over the next few days, strange things kept happening. My belongings would be moved when I wasn't home, and I'd hear faint whispers in the middle of the night. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, or if there was something, or someone, I wasn't seeing. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. My blood ran cold. I peered through the peephole, but no one was there. I opened the door cautiously, and that's when I saw it. A small, folded piece of paper on the floor. I picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it. The message was short, written in messy handwriting. "You should have listened." The words sent a chill down my spine. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind racing. Who was leaving these messages? And what did they want from me? The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I bought a small security camera and installed it near my front door. That night, I stayed up late watching the live feed on my phone. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as I was about to give up and go to bed, I saw movement on the screen. A figure appeared, dressed in a dark hoodie, their face hidden. They knelt down and placed something on my doorstep. My heart pounded as I watched them walk away, disappearing into the shadows. I waited a few minutes before opening the door. There was another note, this one longer than the last. It read, "You're not safe here. They're watching you. Leave now." I felt a surge of panic. Who were they? And why were they after me? I packed a bag with a few essentials and decided to spend the night at a friend's house. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The next morning, I returned to my apartment, determined to find answers. But when I opened the door, I was met with chaos. The furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in strange symbols drawn in red paint. In the center of the room was a single word scrawled in bold letters, "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag and left, vowing never to return. To this day, I don't know who the man in the hood was or what he was trying to warn me about. But one thing's for sure, I should have listened. Story number 3. It was a cold, rainy evening, and I was on the last train home. The carriage was almost empty, save for a few tired commuters scattered here and there. I was sitting by the window, staring out at the blur of lights and shadows as the train rattled through the night. That's when I noticed him. A man in a long, dark coat was sitting across from me, his face partially hidden by the brim of his hat. He wasn't reading or looking at his phone like everyone else. Instead, he was staring directly at me, his eyes piercing through the dim light of the carriage. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the book in my hands, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. Every time I glanced up, he was still there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, the train pulled into the next station, and a few passengers got off. I thought he would leave too, but he didn't. Instead, he stood up and walked over to me, sliding into the seat directly across from mine. My heart started to race. I wanted to move, to get away from him, but I felt paralyzed. He leaned forward, his voice low and gravelly. "You don't belong here," he said. I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "Excuse me?" He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. He placed it on the table between us and pushed it toward me. "Take it," he said. "It's for you." I hesitated, my mind racing. Who was this man? And why was he giving me a notebook? Before I could say anything, the train lurched to a stop and he stood up abruptly. "This is your stop," he said, his tone final. I looked out the window and realized he was right. This was my station. But how did he know that? Before I could ask, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the carriage. I sat there for a moment, stunned, before grabbing the notebook and hurrying off the train. As I walked home, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter. The notebook felt heavy in my hands, and I was tempted to open it right then and there. But something stopped me. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and sat down at the kitchen table. I took a deep breath and opened the notebook. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and sketches. At first, I couldn't make sense of it, but as I flipped through the pages, I realized it was some kind of journal, a record of events, dates, and names, and then I saw it. My name. It was written in bold letters at the top of one of the pages, followed by a series of dates and locations. My heart skipped a beat as I read through the entries. They detailed my daily routine, where I went, what I did, even what I ate. But the most chilling part was the last entry. It was dated for today, and it read, "She doesn't know yet, but she will, soon." I slammed the notebook shut, my hands trembling. Who was this man? And why was he watching me? The next few days were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. I started noticing the same car parked outside my apartment, the same figure lingering in the shadows. One night, as I was walking home from work, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I heard it. A voice, low and familiar. "You should have listened." I spun around, and there he was. The man from the train. He was standing a few feet away, his face still hidden in the shadows. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small black envelope. He tossed it at my feet and walked away, disappearing into the night. I picked up the envelope with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of me, taken from a distance. With a red circle drawn around my face, on the back of the photo there was a message: "You're running out of time." Story number 4, it all started with a letter. I was cleaning out my grandmother's attic after she passed away, sorting through decades of old memories and forgotten treasures. Among the dusty boxes and faded photographs, I found a small, weathered envelope. It was addressed to me. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the postmark was from over 20 years ago, but there was no denying it. The letter was meant for me. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling with a mix of curiosity and unease. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in neat cursive writing. "If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here. There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago, but I was too afraid. Now it's up to you to uncover the truth. Be careful. Not everything is as it seems." The letter was signed with a name I didn't recognize. Eleanor. I stared at the words, my mind racing. Who was Eleanor? And what truth was she talking about? I spent the next few days trying to piece together the mystery. I asked my family about Eleanor, but no one seemed to know who she was. My grandmother had never mentioned her, and there were no records of her in any of the family documents. Frustrated, I decided to dig deeper. I went through every box in the attic, searching for clues. That's when I found it. A small, locked, wooden box hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. The box was intricately carved with strange symbols etched into the lid. It looked ancient, like something out of a museum. I tried to open it, but it was locked tight. I spent hours searching for the key, but it was nowhere to be found. Finally, I decided to break the lock. Inside the box was a collection of old photographs, a faded map, and another letter. The photographs were of people I didn't recognize, but one of them caught my eye. It was a picture of a young woman standing in front of an old house. On the back of the photo was a name: Eleanor. The map was even more intriguing. It was hand-drawn, with a series of symbols and markings that I couldn't decipher. In the center of the map was a location circled in red, a place I had never heard of. The second letter was shorter than the first, but no less cryptic. "The truth lies where the shadows meet. Follow the map, but beware. They are watching." I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward the mystery. I decided to follow the map, hoping it would lead me to answers. The journey took me to a small remote village nestled in the mountains. The place was eerily quiet, with an air of secrecy that made my skin crawl. The villagers were reluctant to talk to me, but I eventually found an old man who was willing to help. He recognized the map and told me it led to an abandoned house on the outskirts of the village. According to local legend, the house was cursed and no one who entered it ever returned. I was terrified, but I couldn't turn back now. I made my way to the house, my heart pounding with every step. The place was in ruins, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the floorboards groaned under my weight. I searched the house room by room, finding nothing but decay and emptiness. But then I found it. A hidden door beneath the stairs. It was small and barely noticeable, but it was there. I pulled it open and found a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. I hesitated, my fear threatening to overwhelm me. but I knew I had to keep going. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. At the bottom of the stairs was a small stone room. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a single object, a small, ornate key. I picked up the key, my mind racing. What did it unlock? And what did it have to do with Eleanor? As I turned to leave, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating the empty room. But then I saw it, a shadow moving in the corner. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow shifted, and I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was a person. Before I could react, the figure stepped into the light. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes filled with sorrow. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I recognized her immediately. It was Eleanor. Story number 5. It was a rainy afternoon when I first saw the mirror. I had just moved into my new apartment, a quaint little place on the outskirts of town. The building was old, with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it had a charm that I couldn't resist. The landlord had mentioned something about the attic being off limits, but I didn't think much of it at the time. That all changed on my third day there. I was unpacking boxes in the living room when I heard a strange noise coming from above. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the ceiling. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was persistent, almost hypnotic. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up to the attic. The door was locked, but the key was hanging on a hook nearby, just as the landlord had said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The attic was cluttered with boxes, furniture, and other forgotten items, but what caught my eye was the mirror. It was a large, ornate mirror, its frame intricately carved with strange symbols and patterns. The glass was cloudy, almost opaque, but I could still see my reflection staring back at me. There was something unsettling about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. But before I could think too much about it, I heard the tapping, again. This time it was coming from the mirror. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from inside the mirror. I took a step closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving inside it, and then I heard it. A voice, faint and distorted but unmistakable. "Help me." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Was it my imagination? Or was there something or someone inside the mirror? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the tapping, the voice echoing in my mind. The next morning, I decided to do some research. Went to the local library and spent hours poring over old newspapers and records. That's when I found it. A story about a woman who had disappeared in the building over 50 years ago. Her name was Clara, and she had been a tenant in the same apartment I was living in now. According to the article, Clara had been obsessed with an old mirror she had found in the attic. She claimed it was haunted, that it showed her things, terrible things. Her neighbors thought she was crazy, but then one day, she vanished without a trace. The mirror was never found. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the article. Could it be the same mirror? And if so, what had happened to Clara? I went back to the attic, determined to find answers. The mirror was still there, its surface as cloudy as ever. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. "Clara?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. For a moment nothing happened, and then the surface of the mirror rippled again, and I saw her. She was standing on the other side of the glass, her face pale and her eyes filled with desperation. She looked just like the photograph in the newspaper, but older, more worn. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to help me." "How?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How can I help you?" "Break the mirror," she said. "It's the only way." I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The mirror was beautiful, a piece of history. But the look in Clara's eyes was enough to convince me. I grabbed a hammer from one of the boxes and swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered instantly, shards flying everywhere. And then, something strange happened. The air grew cold, and a faint, wispy figure emerged from the broken mirror. It was Clara. She looked at me, her eyes filled with gratitude, and then she vanished into thin air. I stood there for a moment, stunned, before realizing that the tapping had stopped. The attic was silent, the air still. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. The next few days were a blur. I started noticing strange things. Shadows moving in the corners of my vision, whispers in the middle of the night, objects moving on their own. It was as if breaking the mirror had unleashed something dark and dangerous. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was coming from the wall beside me. I turned on the light, but there was nothing there. And then I saw it, a faint ghostly handprint on the wall, right where the tapping had been. I knew then that I had made a mistake. Breaking the mirror hadn't freed Clara. It had released something else, something far more sinister. Now it's after me. Story number 6. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. My friends and I had rented a cabin deep in the woods, far away from the noise and chaos of the city. The place was beautiful, surrounded by towering trees and the soothing sounds of nature. We spent the first day hiking, cooking over a campfire and laughing under the stars. But on the second night, everything changed. It started with a sound, a faint rustling in the bushes outside the cabin. At first, we thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but as the night went on, the rustling grew louder, more deliberate. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves it was nothing, but then we heard the footsteps. They were slow and heavy, crunching against the dry leaves outside. We froze, our laughter dying in our throats. The footsteps circled the cabin, pausing every now and then as if someone, or something, was peering through the windows. "Who's there?" One of my friends called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, only silence. We decided to lock the doors and windows, hoping it was just a prank or a lost hiker. But deep down, we all knew something was wrong. The next morning, we found footprints outside the cabin. They were large, much larger than a human's, and they didn't look like any animal tracks we had ever seen. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just our imaginations running wild. But that night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer. We huddled together in the living room, the fire crackling in the fireplace. The footsteps circled the cabin again, but this time, they didn't stop. They grew louder, more aggressive, until it sounded like whatever was outside was trying to get in. And then we heard it. A low, guttural growl that sent chills down our spines. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed awake, clutching whatever weapons we could find, a knife, a flashlight, a frying pan. The growling continued until dawn, when it finally faded away. The next morning, we decided to leave. We packed our things as quickly as we could, our hands shaking with fear. But as we were loading the car, we noticed something strange. The trees around the cabin were covered in deep, jagged scratches, as if something had been clawing at them. And then we saw it. A symbol carved into the trunk of the largest tree. It was a circle with a line through it, surrounded by strange, twisting patterns. We didn't know what it meant, but we knew we had to get out of there. The drive back to Wei, the city was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just a bad dream, that we had let our imaginations get the better of us. But then, a week later, I received a package in the mail. It was a small, wooden box with no return address. Inside was a note and a photograph. The note read, "You shouldn't have come here. Now it knows where you are." The photograph was of the cabin taken at night. In the background, barely visible among the trees, was a shadowy figure. It was tall and thin, with long, claw-like fingers and glowing red eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the photo. Whatever we had encountered in the woods, it wasn't done with us. The next few weeks were a nightmare. I started hearing the footsteps outside my apartment, the same slow, heavy crunching I had heard at the cabin. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find claw marks on my windows and the symbol from the tree carved into my door. My friends experienced the same thing. One of them even claimed to have seen the shadowy figure standing outside their house, watching them through the window. We tried to tell ourselves it was just a coincidence, that we were letting our fears get the best of us. But deep down, we knew the truth. Whatever was in the woods, it had followed us home. Story number 7. It all began with a diary I found in the basement of my new house. The house was old, a Victorian-era building with creaky floors and a history that sent shivers down my spine. I had bought it at a bargain price, and though everyone warned me about its eerie reputation, I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. That was before I found the diary. It was tucked away in a dusty corner of the basement, hidden inside a rusted metal box. The diary was small, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. The pages were yellowed and the handwriting was delicate, almost elegant. The first entry was dated October 12, 1923. Today I moved into this house with my husband Charles. It's a beautiful place, but there's something about it that feels off. The walls seem to whisper when the wind blows and the shadows in the corners don't quite match the light. Charles says I'm imagining things, but I know what I feel. I flipped through the pages, my curiosity growing with each entry. The diary belonged to a woman named Eleanor, and as I read further, her words painted a picture of a life filled with fear and paranoia. October 15th, 1923. I heard footsteps in the hallway last night. Charles was asleep beside me, and when I checked, there was no one there. But I know I heard them. They were slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth, waiting for something. October 20th, 1923. I found a strange symbol carved into the wall of the basement. It's a circle with a line through it, surrounded by twisting patterns. Charles says it's nothing, but I can't shake the feeling that it means something terrible. October 25th, 1923. The whispers are getting louder. I hear them at night coming from the walls. They're not in any language I recognize, but I can feel the malice in them. Charles still doesn't believe me. He thinks I'm losing my mind. The entries grew darker as I read on. Eleanor's fear was palpable, her words filled with desperation. November 1st, 1923. I saw it last night. A shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall and thin with glowing red eyes. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It just stood there watching me until the sun rose and it faded away. November 5th, 1923. Charles is gone. He left in the middle of the night without a word. I don't know where he went, but I know it has something to do with the thing in the house. I can feel it watching me, waiting for the right moment. The final entry was dated November 10th, 1923. I can't take it anymore. The whispers are constant now, and the shadow follows me everywhere I go. I've tried to leave, but the doors and windows won't open. I'm trapped. If anyone finds this diary, please don't stay in this house. It's not just a house, it's alive. And it's hungry. I closed the diary, my hands trembling. The entries were unsettling, but I told myself it was just the ramblings of a woman who had lost her mind. That night I heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, just like Eleanor had described. I lay in bed, my heart pounding as the sound grew louder. And then I heard the whispers. They were faint, at first barely audible, but they grew louder and more insistent. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the malice in them, just like Eleanor had said. I grabbed the diary and ran to the basement, hoping to find some clue, some way to stop whatever was happening. But when I opened the metal box, the diary was gone. In its place was a single sheet of paper covered in the same elegant handwriting. You shouldn't have read it. Now it knows you're here. I felt a chill run down my spine as I heard the footsteps behind me. I turned around and there it was, the shadowy figure, tall and thin, with glowing red eyes. It stepped closer, its claw-like fingers reaching out for me. I tried to run, but the basement door slammed shut. trapping me inside. The last thing I remember is the whispers, growing louder and louder until they drowned out everything else. Story number. It was supposed to be a shortcut. I was driving through the countryside trying to avoid the traffic on the main highway. The GPS had led me down a narrow, winding road, and before I knew it, I was lost. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape, and I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I saw the sign. Welcome to Black Hollow. The town was small, with rows of old, dilapidated houses and empty streets. There were no cars, no people, no signs of life. It was as if the entire town had been abandoned. I pulled into the gas station on the edge of town, hoping to find someone who could give me directions. But the place was deserted. The pumps were rusted and broken, and the windows of the convenience store were covered in dust. I got out of my car and walked to the store, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. The door was unlocked, and I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The store was empty, the shelves bare and covered in cobwebs. There was a thick layer of dust on the floor, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty store. There was no response. I walked to the counter, where a cash register sat covered in dust. Next to it was a small leather-bound book. I picked it up and opened it, my heart skipping a beat as I read the first page. If you're reading this, it means you've found Black Hollow. Leave now while you still can. This town is cursed, and those who stay never leave. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words. I told myself it was just a prank, but the eerie silence of the town was starting to get to me. I decided to leave, but as I walked back to my car, I noticed something strange. The streets were no longer empty. There were people standing in the shadows, their faces obscured by the dim light. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer to my car, I realized that the people weren't just standing still, they were frozen, as if time had stopped. I got in my car and started the engine, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. But as I tried to drive away, the car wouldn't move. The engine was running, but the wheels were stuck, as if something was holding them in place. I looked out the window and saw the people moving closer, their movements slow and deliberate. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow and lifeless. I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The people were getting closer, their hands reaching out for the car. I closed my eyes, praying that it was just a nightmare, that I would wake up and be back on the highway. But when I opened my eyes, they were still there, their faces pressed against the windows, their hollow eyes staring into mine. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, coming from the radio. Welcome to Black Hollow. You'll never leave. Next story. It started as an ordinary evening. I had just settled into my couch, the dim glow of the television flickering across the walls, when I heard the first sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator, and the distant sounds of traffic outside. At first I ignored it, assuming it was just the house settling or maybe a tree branch swaying against the window. But then, it came again. More insistent this time, sharper, like fingernails scraping against glass. A chill crept up my spine as I turned my head toward the front door. The peephole revealed nothing but the empty hallway beyond. Still, the sense of unease settled deep in my chest, refusing to be dismissed. Maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me, fueled by too many late-night horror movies. But something about the sound felt wrong. I shook it off, chalking it up to paranoia, and returned to scrolling mindlessly through my phone. But just as I started to relax, a new noise cut through the silence, a slow, deliberate creak from the floorboards near the entrance. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was inside. I stayed frozen, listening intently. The sound had come from just beyond the hallway, near the coat rack. My heart pounded as I strained to hear more, but the apartment had gone deathly silent. I reached for the nearest object, a decorative metal candle holder, and clutched it tightly as I slowly rose to my feet. Step by step, I moved toward the hallway, my pulse hammering in my ears. The dim light cast long, shifting shadows on the walls. I inched forward, my grip tightening on the makeshift weapon. As I reached the doorway, I took a deep breath and peered around the corner. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The coat rack stood undisturbed, the door still securely locked. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish for overreacting. But just as I was about to turn back, a cold breeze brushed against my skin. Every window in my apartment was closed. Dread pooled in my stomach as I slowly turned toward the living room. The TV flickered, casting eerie patterns of light across the walls. And then, I saw it. A faint outline, barely visible against the darkness, standing just beyond the reach of the television glow. My breath hitched. My fingers tightened around the candle holder. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, but I could feel its presence pressing against me, heavy and suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The air felt lighter, the weight on my chest lifting. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it? The stress, the lack of sleep. Maybe it was all catching up to me. But the feeling of wrongness still clung to the air like a thick fog. I forced myself to move, my steps quick and unsteady as I made my way back to the couch. My phone screen lit up with a new notification, a text from an unknown number. Don't open the door. My stomach dropped. My gaze flickered to the front door. Had someone been watching me? My fingers trembled as I typed back a response. Who is this? No reply. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I double-checked the locks, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to shake the growing paranoia clawing at the edges of my thoughts. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every sound, every shadow felt like a warning. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been a dream. A weird, unsettling dream. But as I stepped outside to leave for work, my blood ran cold. There, scratched into the wood of my front door, were two words, still watching. And suddenly I knew the night before hadn't been a dream at all. Next story. It started with a knock at the door, not a loud, urgent pounding, but a soft, deliberate tap, just enough to be heard over the low hum of the television. I was sitting on my couch halfway through a documentary when the sound pulled my attention away from the screen. My first thought was that it might be a delivery, but I hadn't ordered anything. A neighbor, perhaps? It was already past 10 p.m., an odd time for an unexpected visit. I hesitated before getting up, suddenly aware of the silence in the house. As I approached the door, a sense of unease settled over me. I glanced through the peephole but saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway of my apartment building. No shadows, no movement, just emptiness. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the sound of the old pipes or the building settling. I took a step back, shaking my head at my own paranoia. But just as I turned away, the knock came again. This time, it was slower. 3 deliberate taps, a shiver ran down my spine. I debated whether to open the door. Logic told me there was no reason to be afraid. It was probably a neighbor who needed something. But something about the way the knocks had come, the strange absence of any visible person outside, made my stomach twist. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hesitant. No answer. I waited a moment, my breath caught in my throat, listening intently for any sound. But there was nothing. No retreating footsteps, no shuffling outside my door. Just silence. I exhaled slowly and forced myself to unlock the door. As the latch clicked open, I hesitated again before finally pulling it ajar, just enough to peek outside. The hallway was empty. A cold draft swept past me, raising goosebumps on my arms. I stepped out just a little, looking both ways down the corridor. Nothing. But just as I turned to go back inside, my eyes caught something small, resting on the floor just in front of my doorway. A single white envelope. No name. No markings. I stared at it, my heart hammering against my ribs. Everything in me screamed to leave it there, to shut the door and pretend I never saw it. But my curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down, picked it up, and stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The envelope was thin, almost weightless. My fingers trembled slightly as I slid my thumb under the flap, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. 2 words were scrawled across it in uneven, almost frantic handwriting. "Don't open it." I frowned. Don't open what? A chill spread through me, and suddenly I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the walls, the subtle weight of the envelope still in my other hand. Then I noticed something else. The envelope. It wasn't empty. There was something else inside, something small and thin. I turned it upside down, letting the contents slip onto my palm. A key. My stomach dropped. I turned it over, inspecting it. It was an old-fashioned key, the kind you'd find in antique furniture or ancient doors. The metal was worn, darkened with age, and it felt unusually cold against my skin. My mind raced with questions. Who left this? What was it supposed to open? And why the note, why the warning? I should have thrown it away. I should have ignored it, pretended it never arrived. But my fingers closed around the key before I could think twice. That night, I barely slept. I left the key on my nightstand, but its presence felt heavy, like it was watching me. Every creak of my apartment felt louder, every shadow deeper. And then, just as I was drifting off, another knock came at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. My body went rigid, every muscle locking in place. My breath came in shallow bursts. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just listened. The knock didn't come again. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly. Slowly, I slid out of bed and crept toward the door, my feet making no sound against the floor. I pressed my ear to the wood, my pulse thundering in my ears. Silence. But when I looked down, my blood ran cold. A second envelope had been slid under my door. This time there was no key inside, just another note. You already opened it. Next story. It was supposed to be just another late-night drive home. I had taken this route dozens of times before, a long stretch of highway cutting through a dense forest. The road was quiet, barely any cars passing by at this hour. As I drove, my headlights illuminated something ahead, an old woman standing by the side of the road. She was dressed in tattered clothes, her gray hair unkempt, and her face partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. Something about her posture seemed off. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. As I got closer, she suddenly lifted her arm and pointed straight at me. My stomach tightened. Her eyes, glowing an unnatural shade of white, locked onto mine. Panic surged through me, and I pressed my foot down on the accelerator. As I sped past her, my rearview mirror reflected an empty road. She was gone, completely vanished. A chill ran down my spine. Had I imagined her? A few miles later, I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, exhaustion playing with my mind. But then my phone lit up with a notification. You should have stopped. There was no sender. My heart pounded. I swiped at my phone, trying to make sense of the message, but before I could react, the screen flickered and went dark. An eerie silence filled the car, a suffocating stillness that made the air feel heavy. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was a coincidence, maybe some strange spam message. But the road ahead felt different now, as if the very air around me had shifted. The trees lining the highway loomed taller, their branches stretching out like gnarled fingers. Then, I saw her again. This time, she was in the middle of the road, standing perfectly still, her tattered dress billowing slightly in the windless night. Her eyes locked onto mine once more, and this time, her mouth moved. Though I couldn't hear her words, I could feel them in my bones. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. My breath was shallow, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The woman didn't move. I blinked. She was gone. The road ahead was empty again, just as before. My chest rose and fell with heavy breaths as I tried to steady myself. I glanced at my phone, hoping for some rational explanation, but the screen remained dark. I needed to get home. Now, I forced myself to keep driving, pushing the speed limit as I wound through the deserted road. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her appear again. The shadows of the trees danced in my peripheral vision, and every shape looked like a figure lurking just beyond my sight. Then the radio crackled to life. A burst of static filled the car, sending a jolt through me. The station had been off. I was sure of it. The noise shifted, a garbled whisper breaking through the static. It was faint, almost unintelligible, but one word came through clear as day. Stop. I yanked at the knob, turning the radio off completely, my pulse racing, but the whisper remained, creeping into my ears as if it were inside my head. I didn't stop. Finally, my house came into view. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine. I sat there for a moment, hands trembling. On the wheel, my breath unsteady. I forced myself to step out of the car, glancing around the yard. Everything seemed normal. No eerie figures, no glowing eyes. Just my house, quiet and still. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and double-checking the windows. My heart was still hammering, but I told myself I was safe. Home was safe. Then, my phone buzzed. Another message. This time it was worse. You should have listened. I stared at the screen, my entire body frozen. Before I could react, there was a knock at the door. Soft at first, then louder. Insistent. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat as the knocking turned into pounding. The walls seemed to shake with each impact. Then, silence. I forced myself to peek through the peephole. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the empty doorstep. No, one was there, but as I turned away, my phone lit up one last time with a final message. See you soon. Next story. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories, urban legends, all of it. Just entertainment to me. But that was before I took the night shift at Hollow Creek gas station. It was a small, run-down place just off a deserted highway, surrounded by thick woods. The pay was terrible, but I needed the job. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most nights were uneventful. A few late-night travelers, truckers stopping for gas, but nothing unusual. That changed one night in late November. At around 2:30 a.m., the store was empty and I was leaning on the counter flipping through a magazine. The security cameras showed nothing but empty aisles and the dark parking lot. The night was dead silent, the way it usually was. Then the bell above the door chimed. I looked up expecting a customer, but the store was still empty. A sudden chill ran down my spine. The door had opened on its own, just slightly, before swinging shut again. Maybe the wind, I told myself. But the air outside was still. No movement in the trees, no rustling leaves. I shook off the unease and went back to my magazine. Minutes passed. Then a soft scraping noise came from the back of the store near the stockroom. It sounded like footsteps, hesitant and slow. I froze, my heart pounding. The cameras still showed nothing. Hello? I called out, forcing my voice to stay steady. No response. I grabbed the store's flashlight and walked toward the noise, past the aisles of snacks and drinks. The air grew colder the closer I got to the stockroom door. My breath came out in visible puffs. Something wasn't right. I reached the door, hesitated, then pushed it open. Nothing. The room was empty. Just stacks of boxes and shelves of inventory. I exhaled a shaky breath, half laughing at myself. My mind was playing tricks on me. I turned to leave, but as I did, something caught my eye. A single word scrawled in the dust on the metal shelf. Don't run. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering. That hadn't been there before. Someone, something, had written it. Then the store lights flickered. The humming of the coolers faltered, then returned. A static hiss crackled through the speakers, though no music was playing. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. The scraping noise started again. This time, it was coming from the front of the store, from the counter. I gripped the flashlight tighter and slowly stepped out of the stockroom, scanning the aisles. The store was empty. But when my gaze landed on the counter, I felt the blood drain from my face. The magazine I had been reading was open, its pages fluttering slightly as if someone had just flipped through them. And beside it on the counter sat an old rusted key. I hadn't put it there. The security monitors flickered. For a split second, static filled the screens. Then, an image replaced them. Grainy, distorted footage of the store from an overhead angle. It showed me standing at the counter staring at the monitors, but behind me, just at the edge of the frame, stood a figure. My body went cold. I turned so fast I nearly fell over, swinging the flashlight wildly. Nothing. The store was still empty. Deep, shuddering breath left my lips. I was losing it. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A single notification: do not leave the store. There was no sender. I didn't know what to do. My gut told me to run, to get out, drive away, and never come back. But something about the message made me hesitate, and then I saw it. The security footage had changed. It no longer showed the store. Now it showed the parking lot. And in the grainy black and white image, I saw my own car. The driver's side door was open, and someone was sitting in the front seat. I bolted to the glass windows, my breath fogging up against the cold. My car was there, but the door was closed. No one inside. The lot was empty. My pulse thundered in my ears. I turned back to the counter, heart hammering. The key was gone. I didn't sleep the next day. I spent hours trying to convince myself it had all been exhaustion, my imagination playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something had happened. Something I couldn't explain. The next night I returned to work, my nerves on edge. I told myself if anything weird happened again, I would quit. No paycheck was worth this. For the first few hours, everything was normal. No flickering lights, no strange noises. Then, at 3 a.m., the power cut out. The store plunged into darkness. My phone screen provided the only light, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands shaking. A slow, deliberate knock sounded on the glass front doors. I turned, my stomach dropping. There was someone standing outside. A man in a long coat, face obscured by the darkness. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there. The knock came again. Louder this time, then my phone buzzed. Do not open the door. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in gasps. The power flickered back on. The lights returned. The hum of the coolers resumed. But when I looked at the doors again, the man was gone. I checked the cameras. The footage showed the front doors, but no man. He hadn't been recorded at all. I quit the next morning. The manager didn't seem surprised when I told him. He just nodded, handed me my last paycheck, and said, "Most don't last longer than a week." I never went back to Hollow Creek gas station, but sometimes late at night I'll get a notification on my phone. Do not return. No sender. No explanation. And I don't plan on ignoring it. Next story. The rain poured heavily as I drove along the winding mountain road, my windshield wipers barely keeping up with the relentless downpour. It was nearing midnight, and I was alone, miles away from the nearest town. The thick fog that rolled in made it nearly impossible to see beyond a few feet ahead. My GPS had stopped working an hour ago, and my phone had no signal. I reassured myself that I knew this route well enough, but a creeping unease settled in my chest. The road twisted sharply, leading into a dense forest where the trees loomed over the pavement like silent sentinels. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof of my car and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering. My headlights illuminated a man in a dark, drenched coat, his face obscured by the rain. He didn't move, just stood there unmoving in the middle of the road. My pulse raced as I debated what to do. I couldn't just drive past him. What if he needed help? But something about the way he stood there, rigid and motionless, made my skin crawl. I pressed my horn, a short, sharp blast that echoed through the trees. Still, he didn't move. Instead, he lifted his arm and pointed directly at me. A shiver ran down my spine. Something about the gesture felt wrong. It wasn't a plea for help. It wasn't a greeting. It was a command. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and slowly reversed, putting some distance between us. As I did, the man suddenly dropped his arm and took a step forward, then another, and another. I panicked, throwing my car into drive and swerving past him. As I sped away, I glanced into my rearview mirror. He was gone. My breath came in ragged gasps as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I saw a dim glow up ahead, a small roadside diner, the only sign of civilization for miles. I pulled into the empty parking lot, my hand shaking as I turned off the ignition. Inside, the diner was nearly deserted, save for an elderly man behind the counter. He looked up from his newspaper as I entered, dripping wet. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. I nodded, still shaken. There was a man on the road back there. He was just standing there, pointing at me. The old man's face paled, his expression unreadable. He put down his paper, folding it carefully. "You sure about that?" I nodded, wrapping my arms around myself. "Yeah." I saw him clearly. The man sighed, rubbing his chin. "Folks round here know not to stop for him." My stomach twisted. "You've seen him before?" He nodded slowly. "Not just me. Everyone who's lived here long enough has seen him, always on nights like this." A silence stretched between us. The rain battered the diner's windows, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. I swallowed hard. "Who is he?" The old man shook his head. "No one really knows. Some say he was a traveler who died on that road years ago, waiting for someone to help. Others say he's something else, something that shouldn't be here." A cold dread seeped into my bones. "What happens if you stop for him?" The man didn't answer right away. He just met my gaze, his eyes tired and heavy with something close to sorrow. "You don't make it to where you're going." A sharp gust of wind howled outside, rattling the diner's windows. I shuddered, suddenly desperate to be anywhere, but here. That night I stayed at the diner until the storm passed, but the feeling never left me. Even now I wonder what would have happened if I had stopped, and every time I drive that road at night, I pray I never see him again. Last story. It all started with a single knock at the door. I lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, where visitors were rare. It was past midnight, and I had been on the verge of falling asleep when the sound jolted me upright. Knock. Knock. I hesitated, staring at my bedroom door, which led to the small hallway that ended at my front entrance. My heart was pounding. Who would be knocking at this hour? Knock. Knock. It was firmer this time, insistent. I tiptoed out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept towards the peephole. The hallway light flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows. I pressed my eye against the tiny glass circle and saw nothing. No one was there. A cold wave of unease swept over me. Was it just my imagination? Maybe a prank? Or maybe something worse? I reached for my phone and dialed my best friend, Mark. He picked up groggily. "What's wrong?" he mumbled. "There was a knock at my door twice, but there's no one outside." Mark was silent for a moment before he sighed. "It's probably some drunk messing around, ignore it." I wanted to believe him, but something about it felt wrong. Just as I opened my mouth to respond, knock, knock, knock. Louder, stronger. Right, in front of me, a chill ran down my spine. I hadn't moved. I was still looking through the peephole, and there was still no one there. My breath hitched. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. The sound had been real, but how? Was someone playing a trick on me? Then my phone buzzed in my hand. A message from an unknown number. Don't open the door. A sharp shiver coursed through me. I stared at the screen, my pulse thundering in my ears. I texted back, "Who is this?" No response. I turned off the lights in my apartment, my instincts screaming at me to hide. I grabbed the heaviest object nearby, a lamp, and positioned myself near the couch, keeping my eyes locked on the door. Minutes passed. The air felt suffocating. My phone vibrated again. "They know you're awake." I nearly dropped my phone. My fingers trembled as I typed, "Who?" No answer, just silence, heavy and pressing. I sat frozen, every second stretching into an eternity. Then a whisper, right outside my door. "Let me in." I barely suppressed a scream. The voice was low, rasping, and chillingly unfamiliar. I clutched the lamp tighter, my knuckles white. "I know you can hear me," the voice continued, sickly sweet. "I've been watching you." My legs refused to move. I felt trapped like a cornered animal. The peephole. Maybe if I looked again. I swallowed hard and forced myself forward. My eye met the peephole's glass, and this time, there was something there. A single bloodshot eye stared back at me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. My phone vibrated once more. "Don't run. Don't scream. Just wait." Wait? For what? My mind reeled as I struggled to understand. Then, the lights in my apartment flickered. The air turned ice cold, and the knocking stopped. For the next hour, I sat in complete silence, heart hammering, muscles coiled. There were no more knocks, no more whispers. The air warmed again, and the lights returned to normal. And then, as if nothing had happened, my phone vibrated one last time. "You did well, for now." I never found out who or what was at my door that night. But I moved out the next morning, and I never, ever opened the door after midnight again.